So, I'd like to welcome Tom Lemmey. He's worked for Cumbria Wildlife Trust as a peatland conservation officer for over 3 years. I suspect most of us know that peat is an important habitat for all sorts of reasons. I think in these days it seems to be focused primarily on the role of peat for carbon storage, but of course there are many other reasons. And I remember my first contact with peat, P-E-A-T, was 50 years ago when I walked the Pennine Way with my future wife and wife. And in those days, we're at the start of the Pennine Way. I'm sure some people here have done it. You walk through these amazing walls of peat, bog. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And I think they eventually put down matting to stop people being sucked and disappearing for good into the peat. But that was my first real intimate contact with peat on a massive scale. And of course, in those days, 50 years ago, climate change didn't even exist as a subject, let alone the identification of peatlands as a sort of massive area in terms of their importance in storing carbon. Tom's role encompasses everything to do with peatland restoration and conservation, surveying peatlands and looking for ways in which they can be restored. Some of this takes place actually in the Ullswater Valley, so we're very lucky to have him here. He's responsible for those projects here, and we'll shortly hear, hopefully in some more detail, how that works. His work takes him into the most remote parts of Cumbria and the wettest parts of Cumbria. So it's an exciting job. He grew up in the Lake District, and prior to his work with the Cumbria Wildlife Trust, he's worked in a wide variety of roles on estate management, education, conservation management, as a teacher in the Midlands, and worked on the Isle of Arran. So maybe we'll hear a bit more about that. I don't know. He's passionate about protecting peat and the benefits that can bring to healthy livelihoods and to protection of the environment. So his talk will provide some explanation of the role of Cumbria Wildlife Trust in this whole process and how it interacts with partners and the notion of synergies between different partners to protect this very important habitat. So without further ado, welcome to take the floor and talk about your topic today, which is working to restore Cumbria's peat bogs. Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks everyone for coming, and you've pretty much covered it. I can go home now. So yeah, my name's Tom Lemmey. I work for Cumbria Wildlife Trust, and I work within a small team called imaginatively called the Peat team, and there's a handful of us who all work together with partners to sort of restore and protect the peat bogs of Cumbria. So I'm hopefully, as Tim said, going to give you a bit of a flavour of why we do it, what we do, how we do it. I'm going to start though assuming that you all have come into contact with peat at some point, but perhaps some of you might know more about it than others, but assuming that you don't know a huge amount about peat. And that's really useful because if you understand what peat is, it makes a lot more sense as to what's happening and what we're doing and why. That'll also help us understand why it's important. I'll talk about why Cumbria is particularly important / interesting in regards to the peatlands. Talk about the damage and degradation we see in Cumbria, and what we do in terms of how we find out about how we know it's degraded or is damaged, how we fix it, and then there are people from Matterdale in the room, so thankfully I've put in a little bit about a recent project that's just completed, the Matterdale and Watermillet project. We'll talk about Skiddaw because we're Cumbria Wildlife Trust and we talk about Skiddaw a lot now. And then finally thinking about what we can do as individuals rather than as organisations in terms of protecting peat. So, peat is dead, partially decomposing plant matter. The important part of that is that the partially decomposed rather than fully decomposed. So when plants grow in other conditions, they absorb lots of nutrients, they absorb lots of carbon, and when they die, they decompose. And that decomposition happens as a sort of chemical reaction, but also bacteria, microorganisms, detritivores, and they break it down, and the nutrients and the carbon and everything gets recycled either into the ground or into the atmosphere. That doesn't happen in the same way in peatland, and that's really important. We're going to go on to why that's important, but it's instead of releasing all that carbon and all those nutrients, it's held where it is. So sometimes you'll hear it talked about as if it's been pickled. And for that to happen, you need some conditions that might be familiar to you if you live in Cumbria or spending time here. And then perhaps before I go any further, when I'm talking about the peat that I'm talking about, it's the peat we find in Cumbria, northern latitudes, so northern Europe, Canada, Russia. You do get peat all over the planet, including in the tropics. You get huge amounts of peat, but it forms in a slightly different way for slightly different reasons. So kind of from now on, I'm talking about the peat that we all know in Cumbria. But for peat to form, it needs to be very wet, and very, very wet, sort of Cumbrian levels of wetness. It needs to be nutrient-poor water, and it needs to be quite acidic, and it needs to be quite cool. And those conditions essentially mean it needs to rain a lot. And that's because water that comes from anywhere else, whether it's come through a river, come over land, through soil, through the rock, has changed its sort of chemistry. So it's changed its pH, it's changed the nutrients that are available. The rain that falls out of the sky is very nutrient poor and relatively acidic. When you take into account those conditions, so very wet, very cool, not much in the way of nutrients available, quite acidic, most plants will struggle to grow in those conditions. Sphagnum, the sort of the key thing that we're going to think about, this photo here is of a photo of sphagnum. Sphagnum has evolved to find that as a niche. It has adapted to those conditions. So unlike most plants, sphagnum can grow here in these conditions. And sphagnum is really important because not only can it grow in these conditions, it can almost maintain those conditions, because sphagnum has some qualities that are really important in understanding how peat forms. Sphagnum can hold about 20 times its weight in water. So where sphagnum is growing, because it's raining lots, that water then is actually held in that situation. It's not moving on anywhere, so it sort of increases the wetness of the environment. It also has antimicrobial properties. So you may have heard of, in the First World War, they used sphagnum as a wound dressing, and that was because of these two properties. It could absorb lots of blood, and it could also reduce the chance of infection in the wounds. And that antimicrobial property means that things that might come in after a plant dies and start decomposing, the bacteria and such, can't do that. So that adds to that lack of decomposition. And there are about 34 species of sphagnum that you find in the UK. They're all adapted for these conditions. Some of them are adapted for slightly what we call might call better conditions, so conditions where there's a bit more nutrients, a little more fluctuation in the rainfall or the water levels, but they're all generally have these similar adaptations. Where you get sphagnum growing, then, you get these conditions that are then maintained. And if you get those conditions and they're stable and they're maintained for a long period of time, then you can get peat forming. And that's because when a plant then dies, when the sphagnum or maybe some of the other plants that are adapted to live in these conditions die, instead of decomposing, they're sitting in this very wet, waterlogged habitat. The water is acidic, so it's pickling it a little bit, but it's also got the sphagnum with the antimicrobial actions. It's very cold. There's not a lot of oxygen because it's waterlogged. That plant matter then essentially gets pickled, it gets preserved, and other sphagnum can then grow on top of it. And so what peat is, when we talk about peat, it's all that dead stuff that's underneath the living stuff. So in a peat bog, you get a surface of a peat bog where you've got lots of life, and underneath is everything that was there before compressed. And it's compressed down, and that's what we call peat. You can even dig deep into a peat bog and go back thousands of years, and you can still pull out sphagnum mosses that can be identified to species level, which is remarkable when I would struggle to identify sphagnum moss to species level when it's alive, because you need microscopes and things like that. So it's just important to think about peat. When we talk about peat, it's just lots of preserved dead plants, generally. The final thing, before we move on, is that there are 3 types of peatland, and these are kind of human categories. So there's lots of variation within these and across them. But generally in the UK, we split peatlands into 3 different types. We've got the upland blanket bogs, which, as the name suggests, you find in the uplands. There's the lowland raised bogs, which you find in the valley bottoms and in Cumbria, around the coastal areas, and they form in pretty much exactly the same way. The only big difference to you and me would be the one you find in the bottom of the valley and one you find at the top. The other type you find in the UK is fens. Now, fens are very rare in Cumbria. They form in a slightly different way in that there is a nutrient input, a small nutrient input, often through the sort of geology that's around. But you would find, obviously, large amounts of fens in the East Anglia and Somerset and places like that. And they, in terms of what peat is, it's essentially the same thing. It's just preserved dead stuff. So, why is it important? When we think about why peat is important and why it's suddenly becoming a focus for conservationists, a focus for governments and landowners, is that it can be a good thing and a bad thing. When it's healthy, peatlands offer huge ecosystem services. When it's damaged and degrading, it has loads of problems. So a peatland is a carbon store. It's holding huge amounts of carbon. I'm just going to get my facts right here. Peatland covers about 3% of the world's surface. It contains twice as much carbon as all the trees on the planet. So it's a huge, dense store of carbon that's just sitting there. So when peatland is healthy, it's got a huge store of carbon that isn't being released into the atmosphere, and if it's healthy, it's sequestering, it's taking on more carbon. So each time that sphagnum moss dies and gets preserved and pickled and squashed underneath, that's more carbon that's being taken out of the atmosphere and preserved and not going back into the atmosphere, which I'm sure you can understand why that's interesting to people when they're thinking about the climate crisis. In the UK, they reckon about 3.2 billion tonnes of carbon held just in peatlands. It's a huge store of carbon. Conversely, when it's damaged, it's a carbon source, so it's releasing carbon. So as soon as peat starts degrading, and that's when it's drying out, the oxygen sort of replaces the water, and all that decomposition that hasn't happened over the thousands of years of formation gets going, and it happens really quickly. And they think that about 4% of the UK's carbon emissions are purely from damaged peatlands. So that 3.2 billion tonnes of carbon which is stored, which could be viewed as a really good thing, if the peatlands are damaged, then it moves over into this threat in terms of the amount of carbon that's coming into the atmosphere. Again, when we think about water quality, when a peatland is healthy, it's offering loads of filtration and benefits in terms of the water quality. Most of the water that comes out of the taps in the UK, certainly all of it I would imagine in Cumbria, has come from a peat bog that's then flowed into a reservoir and into the water system. So that's filtering a lot of the water, a really good thing. A damaged peat bog is releasing a lot of peat and carbon into the water system. So that then has to be removed before the water companies can then make it available. And so the water companies are spending a huge amount of money across the country in getting peat out of water. And they've identified that if they fix their peat bogs, which often sit above their reservoirs, that's a hugely financially, it's a no-brainer to them. It's much cheaper for them to make the peat bogs healthy than to take the peat out of the water that's been washed into their systems. Again, in terms of flooding, a healthy peat bog has what we call roughness. So that's slowing down the surface flow, plus the fact that sphagnum can hold 20 times its weight in water. The benefits in terms of reducing flood risk and flood severity are huge. Again, a damaged peat bog is the water's flowing across it and through it very quickly. That dry peat is not holding any water at all. And studies have shown in the Peat District, probably from around where you first came into contact with peat, that peatland restoration projects that have been carried out there, they've studied the flood risk and the flood severity downstream, the communities downstream, and they've been able to show that the lag time, that distance between a rainfall event and that peak flow when the flood is happening, has been extended, and that peak has been reduced because the water's been held for longer on the peat bog. And then in terms of biodiversity, peatlands are a very unusual, rare habitat. As we said, only 3% of the planet is peat bogs, and there are numerous species of plant that you'll only find in a peat bog, but there are also lots of invertebrates that either only live on a peat bog or rely on the peat bog, either as a food source or a stage in their life cycle. So bilberry bumblebees, for example, white-faced darter, dragonflies require a healthy peat bog to have a healthy population. And that goes all the way up to things like marsh harriers and hen harriers that you find hunting in and around peat bogs. And obviously with Cumbria Wildlife Trust, we're very proud of the ospreys that also live on and around our peat bogs. And then finally, and this is becoming more and more of a relevant part of my job, is the archaeological and paleoarchaeological interest in peat bogs. So it's not just the plants that die and get preserved in peat bogs, it's anything else that dies and gets put in a peat bog, either accidentally or deliberately placed in a peat bog. And you might be aware of bog bodies, and thankfully we've never come across a bog body yet. But those bodies are preserved like the sphagnum and all the other plants that grow in the peat bog, and provide a wealth of information about former sort of societies and communities that lived in and around peat bogs. It's not just bodies that were placed in bogs, though. I would encourage you all, if you're interested in this, after you get home, Google bog butter, and you'll find some amazing quite unbelievable quantities of butter that have been found in peat bogs in Ireland, like several kilos that have been placed. Then they don't know whether it was to preserve it, to hide it from other people, or whether it was an offering, but all preserved for hundreds and thousands of years. The bit that's becoming more and more relevant is the realisation that all that information that is held in the peat bog can be studied and has a huge use to ecologists and paleoecologists to give us an indication of how our climate has changed, how our ecology and habitats have changed around Cumbria and the world. So if you were to think that peat forms very slowly, they reckon a healthy peat bog will create maybe 1 millimetre of peat a year. So 1,000 years will just be shown as a metre of peat. We've taken peat cores on some of our sites that are 9 metres deep, so that's 9,000 years of peat formation. And at each level of that, you can take out the pollen, you can take out the preserved microbial life, the other plants that are there, charcoal, and it gives you an indication of what the climate was like, how healthy the peat was, whether other things were happening around the bog, whether the bog changed into woodland or into grasslands and back again. And when humans started interacting with the bog, you can find layers of charcoal, and then immediately after that you get crops that are found in the peat, and then eventually, because those conditions, it's too wet, the peat kind of carries on forming, and that gets held in the peat. So that's something that we're being more and more expected to do, is take those peat cores to give us that information as well. So why is peat and Cumbria so important to each other? So we've talked about the conditions. It's ideal peat forming conditions. It's cold, it's wet, there's not a huge amount of nutrients. And so post the last ice age, and before humans started interacting on a big scale in the landscape, this peat started forming, and we think it was between 8,000 and 9,000 years ago that the peat started forming. And we've got peat bogs that have shown that pretty precisely, because they can be carbon dated, when they started forming in Cumbria. But if I show you what the map of the peat bogs looks like now, we see quite a fragmented map, and this is obviously very different to how it perhaps was before humans really started getting their hands on the landscape. And you'll see around the edge of Cumbria we've got the North Pennines and the Yorkshire Dales, and the brown is the blanket bog that we find in the uplands, and the red is the lowland bogs. All those other colours are kind of variations of types of bog, often because of changes in the topography, but also because of how humans have managed peat bogs. But you'll see that the patches of brown around the edge in Yorkshire and the Pennines are quite big, whereas in the middle of the Lake District it's very fragmented. So Cumbria is quite a complex because of that. We get quite an unusual topography for peat formation compared to the Pennines. And then we've got lots of issues with other use of the landscape and all the different land ownership. So in 2013, the Cumbria Peat Partnership was formed. Cumbria Wildlife Trust chairs that, but it's a partnership of organisations and landowners and charities who have some interest in peatland. So that's Cumbria Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, the National Park, Natural England, and so on, including the big landowners like the National Trust, United Utilities, and so on. And since 2013, we've surveyed about 12,000 hectares, which is about 13.5 times the area of Ullswater. And we've restored about 5,000 hectares, which is about 5.5 times the area of Ullswater. So there's still a long way to go, but our capacity is increasing all the time. So moving on to the damage and degradation. So water loss is the issue with peatland damage in Cumbria. If you go into the Pennines, they have some slightly different issues, not just water loss, but with air pollution that's affecting peat. Less of an issue in Cumbria. The main thing that we experience is the loss of water from the peat. So when the water leaves peat, we get all those actions happening, which mean we get the release of the carbon into the atmosphere, we get the release of sediment and carbon into the water, we get the impacts on flood risk, we get the impacts on biodiversity and things like that. And the main reason for that loss of water from a peatland is because of how the land's been managed. In the lowlands, around the Solway and the Morecambe Bay area, we get large areas of peatland that were drained for agriculture mainly, but also peat cutting for fuel and even peat cutting for horticulture in sort of more recent times. And that's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, certainly since the records from post 1066, when the monastery started being expanding. They were responsible for a lot of the drainage of peatland. And you can see a big drainage ditch that's been dug through this peatland on the Solway. And the water that's in that bog is obviously, in that drain is obviously leaving the bog very quickly. And if the drain wasn't there and the bog was healthy, that water level would be close to the surface, and it's about a metre or so below. In the uplands, similar sort of activities, but on a much sort of smaller scale in terms of the features we see. So there's still lots of draining of the land that's happened, and you can. This is a much more subtle photo, but you might be able to see through the centre of that photo is a sort of darker line, and you see there's a depression. That's the peat that's drying out around that drain, and it's being lost. And then what happens once the peat starts drying out, amongst other things, you get habitat change. So that once the peat's drying out, other plants can get in. You get grasses that can come in, and trees as well. And when they start colonising, they can outcompete the sphagnum, and then they have other knock-on effects in terms of accentuating the drying out as well. And when peat dries out, you get other features. So the peat starts cracking, and then you get things called hags. So if you've been up in the fells here on a bit of peatland that hasn't been restored, but in Yorkshire Dales, the Pennines, Scotland, hags are quite a recognisable feature. You can see them from a long way away. And you can see here the amount of water that's been lost from that hag. And that exposed peat is releasing carbon, it's releasing sediment and so on. So these are all problems that we're dealing with and identifying when we go out on site before we start any work. So how do we know? We start by surveying. So we could do that starting off at our desk. So we do what's called a desk-based survey. And that uses satellite imagery. Increasingly drones are used, but we are sticking with satellites for the moment. And that identifies those features like those drains, the hags and things you can spot. But you can also spot changes in the habitat. And that allows you to sort of focus your actual on-the-ground survey. So we'll go out and we'll take peat depths and we'll follow a methodology that will be the same not only across Cumbria but across the country, so that the data we can collect can be then compared with other places, and we can look at how the landscape's changing. And so we'll go out on site, and every 100 metres we'll take a peat depth. We'll do a quadrant, and we'll look at the sort of indicator species. So there are plants that we might expect to find on a healthy bog, like the sphagnums, like cotton grasses, cranberry and such. But then there are indicator species that suggest the peat's not in a good condition. So certain types of grass, Molinia grass and such, is a real indicator that the peat's drying out. So we'll do that every 100 metres. And that will give us a picture of the depth of the peat, but the health of the peat, and we'll also identify those features that might be contributing to the damage to the peat. We'll also do some more focus monitoring. So on a site we would identify 10 places that we can go back to very precisely that we'll mark on the ground, but also using very precise GPS devices that we can go back to at any point in the future, and we'll do much bigger surveys of that sort of 2 metre and 10 metre square area like they're doing here, and they'll identify every single plant species that's in that. They'll count them, look at the area, but they'll also put in permanent monitoring devices that will monitor the water level and how that changes over time. And obviously what we're hoping, once restoration has happened, that water level rises close to the surface. And that will be the first indicator that things are working, and then the plants will follow if you've got everything right. So how do we fix peatland? So the key to this is understanding the hydrology. So once we've found a site, we've surveyed it, we've identified what the damage to that site is and why the damage has been caused. Essentially, we're trying to stop the water leaving the bog as quickly as it is doing at the moment. So the rain falls in a bog and eventually will find its way out. It's just finding its way out too quickly at the moment. So our job is, very simply, is just to slow the water down and hold it there for a little bit longer. So there's two parts to restoration. There's stopping the damage occurring and stopping that carbon being released. And that can happen quite quickly. You can see results for that quite quickly. As soon as you've got the water level up, any peat that's underneath that water is not releasing carbon anymore. The second part is much slower and much more tenuous, because that's when you can be sure that peat is being created. That's the goal, that's the dream. If you create the conditions for sphagnum to grow, and you can keep them like that for decades and centuries, remembering that you can only see 1 millimetre of peat growth in a year, there's unlikely to be a site that I work on in Cumbria that by the time I retire, I can say that peat is forming on it, which is a bit difficult to get your head around when you first started work, that you weren't going to see any of the results. But there are those indicators that you might be on the right track, and we are seeing indicators that things are on the right track. Realistically speaking, we're a long way off saying that we're sequestering all the carbon that we need to stop the climate crisis. But it's contributing is the important bit. So what do we do? Well, wherever possible, we use the materials that are there in the ground, and the best material for preserving peat is peat. So in this photo, there was a drainage ditch cut through this landscape. I think this might even be watermillock. And what the contractors have done, once we've identified that drainage ditch, they've put in what we call peat dams. So basically using peat from around about to block up the ditch, and that's stopping the water flowing out of the ditch and out of the bog so quickly. And that will be done sort of regular intervals down that drainage ditch. The secondary benefit of that is that it's then spreading the water across the surface. And once you spread the water across the surface, again, you're slowing the flow, contributing to improvements in the flood risk, but you're also hydrating that area around the drain as well. And you can see there that this was taken only a few weeks after this dam was put in, and the water is draining out and spreading over the surface, which is really good, because once you get water on the surface, you can get sphagnum growing. Here's another photo of a similar thing. So it's not just those ditches that we try to block up, we also try and block up gullies. So where peat dries out, you get a crack, and then the water erodes that, and you get a gully forming. We'll block that up where possible with peat. Sometimes because of the quality and the amount of peat that's there, or the steepness and the amount of water that's flowing through it, we'll use timber or stone. But peat's always the cheapest and the most effective material that we've found that can be used on a peat bog. The other thing we do is use the peat to, once we've got those problems solved, is to rebuild what we call peat bunds, and they're maybe 3 to 6 to maybe 9 metres, very shallow bunds, so like piles of peat, which we create arcs with, and that holds the water on the surface so it doesn't flow over the surface as quickly, and we're just slowing down the water. Once we slow down water, the sphagnum can grow. We also reprofile those hags, so we'll strip back the turf that's growing on top of the hag, we'll put it into a much more gentle slope, and then place the turf back on top. That stops that erosion happening, it stops the oxygen getting to the peat, and ultimately more peat to form and sphagnum to grow. So this is the same, roughly the same location. So this hag here with the stone in the background, this is in Great Moss in Eskdale, and you can see the stone in the background. That hag has kind of been blended into the landscape, and then on the left there, the contractors are putting one of these bunds to hold the water at the base of that hag, again all contributing to rehydrating the peat that's there and hopefully creating conditions that the plants that we want can grow. On the lowlands, it's a little bit different. So on a lowland bog, you get much more uniform depths of peat and you get much deeper quantities of peat. So this is up on the Solway Firth, and there may be about 5 to 9 metres of peat on this bog, and it will be very consistent all the way through. So the problem on a lowland peat bog is often that it is universally dry 1 metre or 2 metres down. So we want to get the water level up. So the system we use there is what's called a deep trench cell bund, which is you dig a deep trench in the peat and you dig down through the damaged peat into the good peat, and then you get a bit more good peat from a borrow pit, and you refill that ditch and you compress it down, and you are essentially creating a almost impermeable dam underground. So the water that is flowing through that dry peat in that top metre or 2 metres hits this wall and then rises up. So this is what's happened here. This is taken the same day that the digger has moved through this landscape. So already the water that was flowing out of the bog into the fields on the right has been held there, and it's raised up that quickly. And as soon as you've got this, you've got ideal conditions for sphagnum, where you get a shallow pool of water, or the water's just below the surface, and you can get sphagnum growing. So this photo was taken the same day, or maybe the day after the diggers left this part of the site. This is the same photo a few weeks later, from a drone looking back towards where that last photo was taken. You can see how they create these cells so you can hold water in a variety of places, and it adds another bit of security. If one cell breaks, all the water from the bog doesn't find a way out. It's sort of isolated as well. And you can see there that the water level impact is not just along the edge of the bog, but it's moving all the way into the bog beyond where the actual cell bunds and the deep trenches were dug. And then finally, sometimes we have to give the plants a helping hand. Once we've improved the conditions, we occasionally will introduce plants, and the sphagnum plants and the cotton grasses and so forth. And I had this photo is from one of our projects at Nichols Moss, which is a Cumbria Wildlife Trust reserve. And that was, I'd recommend you look that up on the website and on YouTube, because there's an interesting film about what we did there, which is a bit more experimental. But we've stripped a lot of the surface, which was a field, down to the peat that was there originally. And then we've planted the sphagnum in there, including putting in those bunds, and we've raised the water level. That sphagnum would have been planted, it's probably the size of a £2 coin, in March or April. When we came back in October, it had more than doubled, maybe 3 or 4 times the size of its originally. So it grows very quickly when the conditions are right. So that's an indication we've got the conditions correct. The other reason this photo is there is that the plant that's in the middle is a sundew. We've not introduced sundew. It's quite a difficult one to introduce and propagate, although people are finding ways. But we've not done that. That's found its own way into there. Within a matter of months of that field being grazed by sheep and grass, it now has bog plants finding their own way in there. And Sundew is one of the more interesting ones because it's adapted to those poor conditions. It gets its nutrients from flies. It's a carnivorous plant that we find on bogs. So it's always quite exciting when you find one of them. And often we use volunteers to do that. So if you are interested in having a role in peatland restoration, there's 2 photos here make it look very appealing. There's no getting away from the fact that working on bogs is a wet job, but it is quite a lot of fun, especially when you see the response so quickly. I'm just going to really quickly go through Matterdale and Watermillock because it's probably the most local site to here. And if you were out in Matterdale and Watermillock over this winter, you'll have seen diggers all over the place getting to some quite extreme locations. And they were working on a project where we combined 2 sites, the Watermillock Common and the Matterdale Common, and it's a National Trust owned land, so we're working in partnership with them, and the funding came mainly from the Natural England Peatland Grant Scheme, which is a huge fund that the government has been running up until this year, that was focused almost entirely on the carbon benefits of restoring peatlands. The National Trust also provided some sort of match funding for that as well. And this is the survey that we did of Matterdale Common. It's perhaps not that useful from where you are, but you might be familiar with the site. The coach road is at the top of that picture there, with if you've walked along the coach road, that big flat area is where those green stripes are. So those are grips that have been dug in to drain there. We surveyed across Matterdale and Watermillock 485 hectares. So if you imagine a hectare is 100 by 100 metres, and we were measuring every 100 metres. A lot of survey points. We recorded 4 kilometres of grips, that's drainage ditches that have been dug through the peat to dry it out. We recorded 21 kilometres of hags, so those exposed bits of peat that are really damaging to the surrounding peat. So there's 21 kilometres of peat of hags that were recorded there. And in response, we put in 370 peat dams and we made 15 kilometres of peat bunds, amongst other things. If you've wandered over that site, you might see some timber dams and some stone dams as well that are all contributing to the effects of that project there. And then Skiddaw a future project, so you may have heard about Skiddaw. You may have even donated to Skiddaw, which we're very grateful for. And a lot of the media attention there has been on the Atlantic rainforest creation, which is an exciting habitat in itself. Don't want to do that down. But there is also a lot of peatland up there. There's about 436 hectares we've surveyed just this summer between the team. And Skiddaw's quite interesting because a large part of that site is very similar to everywhere else in Cumbria. It's been farmed, but also it's been managed for shooting in the past. So there's a lot of features that you would expect to see more in the Pennines, including some huge grips. So you might just see my colleague Mel there is stood in one of those drainage ditches. So it's well over head height, these ditches. They're huge, and the impact on the peat that's around it is really obvious. And the main impact on Skiddaw is that it is full of heather. So when peat starts to dry out, you get heather starts colonising and outcompetes the sphagnum quite easily. So that's going to be one of our big issues, is how we manage the hydrology to encourage the sphagnum to get back onto site and that heather to die back a bit. Heather is part of a healthy peatland system, certain species more so than others, but it shouldn't dominate the habitat. So there's lots of work to be done on there, but there has been actually restoration work on the site historically. So there are some sites that are recovering quite remarkably well. There's some lovely patches of very wet bog with all the plants that you'd expect to see on a good piece of bog. So to finish, what can we do as individuals? So I've said go completely peat-free, so we all might be aware of peat-free compost, and obviously there's some good local products out there that are coming onto the market or already on the market. But when we think about going peat-free, we're asking people to think about what's called sort of hidden peat. So buying plants from garden centres that are not grown in peat. If you buy cut flowers, and making sure that they're not grown from peat, but also food products that are grown using peat. And the main one is mushrooms. Traditionally, mushrooms are grown on peat. That's then, once the mushrooms have been harvested, and that compost, which is mainly peat, is then disposed of, and then all that carbon gets released into the atmosphere. So looking for supermarkets, I think Sainsbury's is one that's gone peat-free with its mushrooms. Is something to really think about. Visiting a peat bog is, on a nice day, is a lovely experience. So this is a lowland bog. This is Nichols Moss, which is one I really like because it's one of the first ones I worked on. Very pretty. And then if you want to go into the uplands, this is Armboth, or the Peewits, which was sort of notoriously, for the Lake District, probably the worst bit of peatland out there, and it was, like you say, just vast areas of black peat that would swallow up boots quite easily. This is unusual in the Lake District in that it's a restoration project with the National Trust that has had several phases, so we've been able to go back to site and expand it and tweak it. So all that sort of pale green in that photo is sphagnum that's now colonising the peat that was there. It still is there, but has been rehydrated so that sphagnum can grow and it can be protected. And then you get these amazing displays of the cotton grass at the right time of year. And then finally, I would ask if you want to get involved. So we do work with volunteers in a variety of ways. One of the ways being that long-term monitoring. The amount of sites that we've worked on now is expanding, and our team is not expanding at the same rate. So we've got a huge amount of sites that need people going back and to monitor how the landscape is changing. So we have a team of volunteers that go out and do that, which would always welcome additional individuals or groups. So some people go and have a group of them, and they have their own bog that they go back to 3 or 4 times a year to look at. We also have occasionally those planting days, which are perhaps more fun, in my mind anyway, but they are wet and muddy. Or if you want to help but don't want to go out onto a peat bog, which is understandable, we collect huge amounts of data. So we're also looking for people who are willing to do some sort of hard number crunching and entering numbers onto spreadsheets and stuff like that. So if you are interested, get in touch with the Wildlife Trust and say you're interested in peatland specifically, and you'll be directed to our sort of volunteer coordinator. I hope I've covered everything, but if you have any questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom. It's really, really interesting to see what you're succeeding in doing. It must be very difficult, actually, to judge success in such things. The time frames are so enormous.
Yes,
and,
yeah.
So in a way, it's frustrating if you plant a bulb and it pops up nice flowers on there. You know, you see, the peat bog's different.
It's a bit different.
Story. I don't know how you feel a reward for what you're doing, and it must be quite complex psychologically to see all the time investing.
I think the success comes in is understanding what those early signals are, like seeing the pools forming, and when you go during a drought and there's still water on the surface is a really good sign. Yeah.
You have in the audience here the creme de la creme of the Friends of the Ullswater Way / Matterdale habitat. You know, we had a talk here given by Lewis Mansfield 2 years ago. He threw down a gauntlet saying, you know, everyone's talking about biodiversity, but no one has any real data on biodiversity loss and so on. And she was at that time the director of the Centre for Protected Areas in University of Cumbria, and she sort of challenged us to make a contribution to this. And from that moment, there was a group of people who set up this programme to try to do the first real habitat conservation work. And when I listened to you just now, I was thinking, there's so much overlap between what you're doing, and the skills you bring, and knowledge and so on, and the skills that are in this room, and interest. Because I think you're touching on a subject which excites a lot of people who are probably they're not quite sure how to address it in a serious way. Questions from the floor and from the Zoomers? Yep. You can kick off first because you're in the front row and you're a woman.
Thank you. Really interesting talk, so thank you. I was particularly interested in, you had one of your images was a site where you'd resown the sphagnum and had the sundew in it, and you said you'd taken the surface off that site, presumably the turf.
Yeah.
And it had been pasture.
Yeah.
So presumably to create that pasture, the farmer or succession of farmers must have modified that in terms of presumably fertilising, draining, and then intensively grazing for a long time. So what I'm interested in is that just taking off that surface, how do you repair the change in the nutrient levels and the hydrology that will have gone with all that sort of turning into pasture?
So with that site, and again, there's a really interesting film online that's just been released that explains it in good detail with some very good before and after shots. But in terms of the drainage, there was very deep ditches around the perimeter, so 2 or 3 metres deep, that we blocked up with peat and filled in. And then we had field drains through, so every 5 or 6 metres there was pipes running across. We just broke them up, so the process of doing that deep trench cell bunding involved the digger smashing through it and rendering those sort of obsolete. So that dealt with the hydrology. Well, mainly dealt with the hydrology. The nutrient, the stripping of the turf is a trial that we kind of took the lead off some successful projects in Lancashire on agricultural land, where they stripped the top, sort of 10 to 20 centimetres of turf is where the nutrient was held. And so in Lancashire did lots of in-depth studies and sampling of the soil to find out where it stopped being nutrient rich. We kind of followed their lead because we didn't have the time or the money, and followed the lead of the contractors who just started scraping away until it went from soil to peat, and there was a very definite boundary. So they stripped that off to remove the nutrients. It won't have removed all the nutrients. So what we're expecting to see is over the next years, decades, is sort of a nutrient level that isn't ideal for peatland, basically, but that it will slowly leach out into the surrounding land. And so what we've also instigated in that same patch of land is there's a shallow, sort of half the field is much shallower peat, so we've turned that into what's called a lag or a fen, which you get around a natural bog, where you get sort of a buffer where you go from very nutrient poor to nutrient rich. So all that nutrient is ideally, we hope, going to leach into that, so you'd find a slightly different sort of habitat and ecology in there. But it's slightly experimental and very long term.
What did you do with all the stuff you took off?
Filled a lot of ditches and built a bit around the edge so that we can get back in again with machinery. So it's built a sort of a causeway, if you like, around the edge.
It's all Simon's home, yes, in the back.
If you're when you're walking across the top of the fell and you'll see sphagnum and sometimes sundew.
Yeah.
What other things would you see if it's healthy in terms of peat bog, and what would be indicators that it's perhaps not in the best of health?
So a healthy peat bog would have a variety of sphagnums, and you get all different. If you look close, well, you don't have to look closely to see. There's a variety of colours of sphagnum, but there are also some that are chunkier than others, and so on. So you'd get a variety of sphagnum. You'd also get cotton grasses, and there's common and hairtail cotton grasses that you'd find on a healthy peat bog. And then you get cranberries on a healthy peat bog. There's records in the archives, I think it's of Levens Hall, of the amount that peasants and tenants were allowed to extract from the bogs around Foulshaw. So there was a healthy peat bog way back when had enough cranberries for people to take barrels and barrels loads off. You also get plants like bog rosemary, which is quite rare in the uplands to find that, but in the lowlands it's not related to normal rosemary, but it looks exactly like rosemary. So that's a healthy bog. Unhealthy ones in the fells, the worst thing you can find is Molinia, which is a type of grass. It's called purple moorgrass. And the problem with Molinia is it's adapted to grow in these wet conditions. It grows a hummock, which then raises the root out of the water, and then that then can outcompete the sphagnum. And it's horrible to walk over because you can get these hummocks that are sort of this big. So there's that. There's heather. So ling heather. When you see the large expanses of ling heather, that would suggest that the peat's drying out as well.
Two hands. See Jane here. Yep.
So we've got an area up above Mackdale End where it's surrounded by forestry, and there's an awful lot of Sitka spruce coming in and just start seeding into that area. What's the best thing to do with that? I mean, you pull it out when it's very young, but then we've been trying to take some of the trees off.
Yeah. The problem with trees, so some trees can grow on peat bogs. It's a bit of a controversial subject in peatland ecology circles, but I think my personal opinion is that you can have some tree species will grow naturally on a peat bog, that you can find naturally on a peat bog, but they're not Sitka spruce, and they're very stunted because of the lack of nutrients, and they grow very sparsely. The Sitka spruce is one of the bad trees you want because, as you'll know, they can spread very quickly. They block a lot of the sunlight. They intercept a lot of that rainwater that the sphagnum needs. They're really bad for peat bogs. In terms of what you can do is, when you've got such a seed source as those forests you've got there right next to your peat, and they're probably some of them are grown on peat, it's a pretty thankless task because they're just going to keep coming until that big bit of woodland is dealt with. So either a lot of patience and just going back and back and back. A lot of the work that volunteers do on Foulshaw moss, for example, is going out and removing rhododendron, and that used to be a commercial forestry, so there's still a lot of seed source there. It's just a case of chopping them down or pulling them out as soon as you see them, really. There's not
been chopped down, to be removed, or?
Ideally, but there's a practical issue there with removing. Having worked on projects where we've tried to remove trees and rhododendron from bogs, it's a difficult task. Ideally, you want to remove it because it's a nutrient source, but I understand the practical barriers to doing that at any sort of scale.
Can I ask if the Zoomers can hear the questions? It's always an issue, and I'm not quite sure the acoustics of the room. Have you had any reaction from the Zoomers as to whether they can hear the questions?
They can't hear now.
They can't hear.
We've not had any feedback to say that they can't hear.
Ah, okay, so they can't hear. Excellent. Other questions? Yes, please.
I was just wondering, in terms of measurable results, do the water companies see reductions in the amount of peat that they have to filter out?
I don't know what company, without wanting to be controversial, what companies
Please be controversial.
are very, they don't necessarily share their data with us on that. The fact that they are very proactive in supporting the work of peatland restoration across the country would suggest they see significant benefits. Yeah.
Linked to that, how do they get the peat out of the water? Is it a filtration process of some sort?
I would imagine so. I don't know enough
Is it
about that.
micro plant material or something in the sediment? Sediment within
It's just sediment, yeah. So it's dried, decomposed, dried out peat that gets, in the water. Yeah.
Other questions? I have one which is linked to your project, because I can't remember now when your project was initiated. It's only last year or year before, I can't remember. But what proportion of the peatland in Cumbria is covered by your project? You've focused on sort of high priority areas. Or how does that work?
I couldn't tell you the proportion of the total amount of peat that we've worked on. In terms of how we identify the areas, it's a combination of those areas that are obviously in need of it, with alongside the willingness of the landowner is the starting barrier. If the landowner isn't interested for whatever reason, that's the big barrier for us even going on and surveying it. So that's where one of the benefits of the Peat Partnership is that we have most of the big landowners on that, so that they will often come to the Peat Partnership and say, we have the Matterdale Common, for example, could this be surveyed and restored? And then the Peat Partnership with Cumbria Wildlife Trust sort of leading that will be able to identify possible funding, and then it's an efficient way of sort of matching up the want and the need with the ability.
My personal view, for what it's worth, is that I think we should I personally would love to go and do a piece of volunteering on one of your bogs.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's possible to organise a day when you or your colleagues to show us how it's done, in reality, preferably when it's raining. Just so we can all get our hands dirty and see a little bit. Because we have these talks every now and again, but obviously it's not more exciting to see the actual work in the field and the difference that you can make as a volunteer. You hear a lot about planting trees, and the groups here have done, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of trees have been planted by some of the people in this hall and online. I'm not sure how many people have actually assisted in a peat restoration program. It's an interesting thing to organise. We did a visit to see the beavers at Lowther not that long ago, and I think a lot of people were interested by that. So maybe if we could talk about organising a visit sometime, we can try and get some volunteers to come and see the reality. James?
Are you still working on that area?
We're still working in terms of you might be aware of the fenced off areas, so we've surveyed that again, because that was restored maybe 8 to 10 years ago. So we surveyed those two small sections this summer, with the mind of seeing how effective that restoration was and identifying any possible additional works that could happen. So that then goes into our sort of, what do they call it? line of sites that are maybe ready once we can find the funding and we find the willing organisations, yeah.
Right.
Is the government support, the funding, matching the, is it being maintained? Is there enough of work that needs to be done?
No. The Peatland grant scheme ran up until April this year, and it was really novel in terms of the amount of money that it supplied and the fact it was over several years. So it was funding to do the surveying and writing restoration reports, and what was called like a discovery phase, where we looked for the sites, we found got the consent of the landowner and so on, and then funding for actually doing the work. That was extended up for this year, so we've got some more sites that are going to be restored this winter. There's some debate as to whether it will be extended beyond that point. There is a hope, in terms of funding for peatland restoration in the future, it becomes a bit more of an unknown, because there's a hope that private finance will come in and carbon trading will play a part. And there's also a hope that whatever the government comes up with as their new schemes for funding land management for farmers and conservation has some clarity as to how that's going to support peatland restoration. Still not entirely clear.
You've got any idea of the timescale of that?
I don't think anyone has an idea of the timescale of that. The other, in terms of other funding, is likely going to be the landowners, especially water companies, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question: to what extent peatland restoration features as a priority in other conservation? I mean, you've got money being injected into conserving forests or wildlife or hedgerows or whatever it may be. Where does peatland restoration rank, in terms of conservation resources coming from the government or other sources?
I wouldn't be able to give you any figures on that. I think with the Peatland grant scheme, the last few years, it's gone up much more, and it's become much more of a priority for governments in the UK. In Scotland and Wales have taken slightly different approaches, but it has been a priority for a few years now.
Any more questions from the audience or from the Zoomers?
One from the Zoom asking how droughts affect peat bogs. Are there any lasting damages from the ice flows?
Well, one of the benefits of a peat bog is it's more resilient. If it's a healthy peat bog, it's more resilient to droughts. Having said, I mean, some of the peat bogs that, if you were to walk over them end of April, beginning of May this year, when we had months of no rain, there was signs that the sphagnum was almost coming bleached. It was dying off or was very pale. Having walked over those same bogs in the last few weeks, they've responded very quickly. So a healthy peat bog should be much more resilient to water loss from droughts and also wildfires. So if you look at some of the fires that have happened in the Pennines on peat bogs, there's some quite dramatic photos of very scorched earth, and then these where we've built, well, not us, but where these peat bunds have been created to hold water. You get these green arcs which suggest that they are effective in that sense.
Is that it from? Yeah. Well, maybe you can say a few words about donations, because it's a tradition here. We try to encourage people who attend either in person or online to make a donation to a charity of your.
Cumbria Wildlife Trust would probably be the one I have.
That's a sort of no-brainer, isn't it? Yeah. So 50% of any resources that people are willing to pay for watching your talk will go to Friends of the Elswater Way, and 50% yes. Thank you very much. I'll just try and wrap up with two, maybe three things. Firstly, for some people here are aware that we've engaged in a new programme called a Citizens Ecology Freshwater Programme to monitor Ullswater, the quality of the water in Ullswater. A questionnaire has been circulated, and today was the final day for people to make to fill in this questionnaire. I don't know how many people in this room and online have been able to do so, but it's quite precious to us because we want to get feedback from people about what they think are the key priorities for monitoring. And the questionnaire sets out some very simple questions. It then takes a couple of minutes to fill in. So I'm just using this opportunity to publicise that, and then we will endeavour to, on the basis of the results, then design a new training programme looking for volunteers to go and sample Ullswater in different places, try and get an idea of the dynamics over the year and the sort of problems that are being faced with, or habitat loss or whatever. So that's one thing. The second thing, I just wanted to highlight that our next talk will take place on the 4th of September, again here in Pooley. I'm not quite sure why, but, well, yes, I do know why. Because the talk is going to be given by Charlotte Fairbairn, who's the creative director of Lowther Estates. She's going to talk about a whole range of things linked to Lowther, including the yellow earl and what he got up to. So that's our next talk, which I think will be fascinating, 4th September and in this hall. And perhaps then just to finalise, I'd like to give, unfortunately our chair, Gordon Lightburn, isn't here at the moment, but the tradition is that he gives a sort of a little thank you speech, as it were. I hadn't done my homework and identified someone to do that instead of me. But I'd just like to thank you so much for opening our eyes to the issues around peatland conservation here. It's fascinating to see what can be done and to see the energy and passion of people that they put into trying to conserve. I think Cumbria Wildlife Trust is doing a fantastic job in this area, and you can rest assured that the Friends of the Ullswater Way and other organisations here are shoulder to shoulder with you in trying to support your efforts to prevent the destruction of peat bogs and to promote their restoration. So thank you once again for coming here tonight.
Thank you.
The weather was, we didn't know how many people would come. You never do, really, these days. But on an August night to come and listen either online or physically here is a great thing. A tribute to you. You've kept everyone really much alive. So thank you again for your support. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. If anyone wants to buy...
Donations go?
Donations are in that basket over there in the corner. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind. And there's some of our literature's up there.